All right, let's go ahead and start tonight, as usual, with a few prayers. I just mentioned everyone that we're celebrating His Holiness's birthday. Hope you had a chance to attend some of the prayers here or perhaps some other events today. Um, I make some prayers at the end, well, when we do our usual dedication prayers for His long life. So let's go ahead and recite just one time this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta, the first time in English, and then 2 more times in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam Ba Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kabsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kapsu Chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho. Right, let's do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit by meditating on the breath for the first few minutes in silence. And then I'll come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight. Let's generate our motivation of bodhicitta. And let's do this tonight by briefly recalling the qualities of the three jewels that we are determined to become when we set this mind of bodhicitta. We are aspiring to become the perfect three jewels for all beings, which encompasses the Buddha jewel, the perfection of one's own welfare, as well as the ability to enact the welfare of others perfectly, the Dharma jewel, to have actualized all the true cessations in our own minds, through having actualized all the true paths. And then the Sangha jewel, where we have freedom from all of what obscures the mind, as well as perfect knowledge of both ultimate truth and conventional truth, the modes and the varieties. So to become the perfect Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, we have to practice this path, but we have to do it with that motivation, that aspiration, to completely fulfill the welfare of all beings, to be dedicated to helping each and every one of them. And within that, the recognition that to accomplish the welfare of others, we have to attain our own welfare. It's impossible to perfectly work for others without that. So we set our sights on that resultant refuge, our own accomplishment of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha in our mental continuum, so that we then can work perfectly for the welfare of all beings and bring them to that same state, become the causal refuge that will help them to accomplish that path. So hold that motivation of bodhicitta very deeply in your heart. So everything we do tonight becomes a cause for the accomplishment of this goal, achieving the perfect three jewels in our own continuum so we can benefit all sentient beings. Hey, good evening. Welcome. This is our fifth class in the series on the Tathagata essence, Tathagata essence, pronounced differently. Sanskrit is kind of a strange language to figure out the exact way to pronounce things. I did want to bring forward one question that was Sean was going to ask at the end of the class, and then we had some difficulties, and he sent it on to me. So I do have that question. It essentially had to do with this idea of when we talk about the Dharma jewel, having those two components, the true cessations and the true paths. At the end of that one verse, it said, the true cessations are that separation from attachment, and then that which causes the separation from attachment, which is the true paths. And he said in his question to me that he kind of assumed that attachment is encompassing all of the delusions. We often talk about how we have the three root delusions, which are attachment, anger, and ignorance, and we often speak of ignorance being the root of those. But his question was just kind of, well, why is attachment singled out and used in that context? And I might point out that actually this is not unusual at all within the Buddha's teachings. In fact, the very first teaching that the Buddha gave when he was teaching the Four Noble Truths, he spoke to the origin of suffering, the second noble truth, as being craving or grasping attachment. Let me actually share with you, this is from the book by Geshe Tashi-Sering on the Four Noble Truths. And this is the truth of origin. And so, I'm sorry, let me go back to that page. It says, now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is three cravings, essentially. Craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. And Geshe Tashi-Sering kind of points out that these three are sort of in relation then to the three types of feelings that we have. We have a craving to get what is pleasurable. That's what we often talk about as attachment or craving, right? Desire. But then we also have a craving for existence, which is kind of the neutral feelings that we have, but in particular, this wanting a continuity of existence. And this is what happens at the end of the life, in our lives in particular, when we get to our deathbed and a karmic seed is ripening. It gets nourished by our craving for existence, our wanting to continue to be in an embodied state. But then we also have, of course, the wish to be removed from things that are painful. It's called there a craving for extermination, but the idea is that we would just as soon be gone and away from everything, even if I have to annihilate myself so I don't have to experience pain, difficulty, suffering. That's the kind of thing that actually that's the motivation that often leads people who commit suicide to do so, right? Is because they think that if they exterminate themselves, get rid of themselves, they won't experience that suffering any longer. But of course, that's not the way out. That's not the solution the Buddha taught. So when we use this term attachment to say separation from attachment or craving or grasping, whatever, it can be referring to the way that craving, this impulse that we have of always seeking something, seeking to get what is pleasurable, to have an end to what is unpleasurable, to have a continuation of existence in a sort of neutral state. All of these sorts of things are part of our mental landscape. So it's not, again, as Sean pointed out in his question, it's not to negate that the other delusions are also separated from. It's just that this tends to be the more common way that the Buddha spoke to our patterns, because we're always kind of in this space of grasping. Being an embodied being, we're surrounded by stuff that we are, especially in the desire realm, that we are continually craving, continually want, or continually wanting to be separated from. So that's the reason that, as I understand it, why that is being singled out even from the very beginning when the Buddha began teaching, is because it's kind of the kind of palpable way that we get involved in samsara. Even though ignorance is there, without a doubt, and ignorance is the root, ignorance doesn't become problematic in a sense until we get some sort of registration of a reaction to what's going on around us. And again, those can all be seen as attachment to what we want, attachment to not getting what we dislike. So hopefully that provides some answer to that question. And let me just check in if there are any questions from last week, from the discussion or from your own self-study on this material. So briefly, what we've done is we've gone through the first 3 Vajra points. Remember that there are 7 Vajra points. We're only going to be covering the first 4. So we've got the next one is hopefully we'll get into tonight. We've got a little bit more material to go through in terms of wrapping up this topic of the 3 jewels. And that's where Maitreya in his text has a few verses that pertain to refuge and the meaning of jewel as well. As I mentioned last week, I did put together a little handout for you that I'm going to put on the screen so that we can work through that and not use the commentary so much. For this, I felt kind of comfortable not using the commentary simply because many teachers don't even cover the commentary. I've mentioned that before pertaining to these first 3 Vajra points. So Vajra topics. So this is, again, a handout that I provided in last week's material. It's out there for those of you who've registered. You can access this. It's again on verses 19 through 21, and then verse 22 on the meaning of jewel. So in terms of the meaning of refuge, I talked about this briefly. I had a few quotes from His Holiness and Venerable Chodron's book on the 4th of that volume that they're doing of the works of compassion and wisdom. I can't remember the exact title. Anyway, the verse 19 is a presentation of conventional refuge. Now, again, conventional is used here in the sense of maybe kind of those things that we would go to refuge for in regard to our practice. They're not the sort of ultimate or final refuge. So the verse actually says, from the perspective of the teacher, the Buddha, the teaching, the Dharma, and the learners, the Sangha, by way of the 3 vehicles and by way of affinity to those 3 activities, the 3 refuges are presented. So it's giving us an idea of kind of 6 different persons, types of persons that kind of explain why refuge is set out as a 3-fold refuge: the teacher, the teaching, and the learner. So let's look at what is on the right-hand side there that I put together based on the commentary. And again, I've given you a little bit of passage if you want to go through that on your own and read that. I'm not going to go through the commentary tonight as part of this. The first way that they're set out are the first 3 persons, which are called here the 3 persons of the 3 vehicles, with their respective resultant refuges. So we kind of talk about them in terms of the refuge that they are seeking to become, in a sense, that they most strongly identify with, if you will. Of course, for the bodhisattvas, it's the Buddha jewel, though in our text it actually says all three jewels are the resultant refuge. But that's because, as I explained with that quote from His Holiness last week, when you become the Buddha jewel, you are the perfection of the Sangha jewel as well as the Dharma jewel. So essentially, if you aim for the Buddha jewel as your resultant refuge, which is what we're all doing when we cultivate bodhicitta, then we are essentially encompassing the other two jewels in their perfect state. Because when you have attained the Buddha jewel, there is no more Dharma jewel to attain. You have fully perfected it. You have all the true cessations, all the true paths. You have complete knowledge and freedom. So you are the full Sangha jewel, the culmination of that. So that is the refuge for bodhisattvas, the first of the three vehicles. Now, as I said last time, there are two fundamental vehicle practitioners, the solitary realizers and the hearers. Now, the way that the Dharma jewel is the refuge for solitary realizers is kind of for two different explanations. One, I think I mentioned last week, which is they tend to rely upon the teachings of the Buddha, in particular the teachings on the 12 links of dependent origination, which most of you have studied. It's essentially a process by which the Buddha explains our entering into samsara, and by virtue of that, our exiting from samsara, because it's basically the reverse of the 12 links. But that's the teaching that they take to heart and try to perfect in their own minds. But moreover, they are called solitary realizers for a reason. They make these very strong prayers to be able to achieve their own state of freedom, their state of arhatship, their final culmination of the fundamental vehicle path. In their final lifetime, they want to do that in a place where no teachers or followers exist. They kind of can perfect their minds in a sort of pristine world where none of that is around them. So in a sense, they don't rely then on the Buddha jewel or the Sangha jewel so much, and they aren't, there's even some of them that are called rhinoceros-like solitary realizers that tend to be more solitary creatures. Apparently this is so for rhinoceroses. I don't really know. Rhinoceri, I don't know what the plural of rhinoceros. So essentially, this is kind of the two ways that they're explained is that, they don't rely upon Sangha jewel or Buddha jewel as a result. They really want to perfect the Dharma in their own minds, and particularly, they want to work with the 12 links of dependent origination, that teaching within the Dharma jewel that allows them to accomplish their result. The hearers, on the other hand, what are called Shravakas in the Sanskrit, they tend to be more congregational. They will hang out with even Mahayana practitioners and listen to Mahayana teachings, but they don't practice them. They are intent upon achieving their own liberation, their arhatship, and they will then take the Sangha jewel as their jewel, because they're not trying to become a Buddha. Neither the solitary realizers, the Pratyeka Buddhas, or the Sangha, or the hearers, the Shravakas, are striving to become a Buddha. They're striving to become an arhat, attaining their own liberation, their own personal nirvana. But essentially, they want to be kind of culminating that in being part of the Sangha jewel, part of the community that supports all of those on their path. So all three of them have some level of kind of compassionate connection to others. It's just the bodhisattvas obviously have the greatest level of compassion for others and a desire to benefit them. Those are the three resultant refuges for the three vehicles. The other way that we can talk about 6 types of beings are for those who have not yet entered a path. And these are 3 different types that would have a causal refuge due to being devoted to making offerings and paying homage and so on to each of the 3 jewels. So essentially, you could say that there are people who have not yet entered the path who have some kind of connection to making offerings to the Sangha, for example, or making offerings to the Dharma, the Buddha, as a way of practicing their path before they've entered into a particular vehicle. And then, of course, the vehicle they enter into, they would then have a resultant refuge that is in line with the first 3 that we discussed. But they essentially would have a causal refuge that is influencing their practice of the path, that is kind of giving them some sort of impetus to do that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the question is, does that correspond then that the 3 in the second group would fall into the category of the 3 for the first group? Because if they're more inclined to make offerings to the Buddha, then they would end up becoming, or maybe perhaps a bodhisattva practitioner. I don't know that it's that definite a correlation, and I haven't seen anything in the text that indicate that, but I would imagine that to some degree that can happen, because one has a strong connection, particularly to the Sangha, for example, and then perhaps one wants to join that community and be supported in that way. I don't know. But I haven't seen that as a definite correlation. Let's go forward then to the next verse. I think that one's pretty straightforward. It's just speaking again to the kind of conventional refuges that beings have in regard to their spiritual practice, either after they've entered a particular vehicle or before they have. Now we're going to have the presentation of ultimate refuge, and this is divided into 2 points. Verse 20 deals with the idea of kind of one side of it, proving that any refuge that is not a Buddha is not an ultimate refuge. This is correlated or related to what I spoke of last week in that quote I gave you from His Holiness. I'll put it back on the screen shortly, but this is kind of saying we have provisional refuges, things that we can take refuge in, these refuge objects that are not the final refuge. By provisional and final, we mean final having fully traversed the path. In fact, let me go ahead and put that on there so that I can share that with you. So let's see, put that, and then all I have to do is do the slideshow from there. And actually, I do have to go back up. So these are the 2 slides I shared last week. The 3 objects of refuge are spoken of as final and provisional refuges. Remember in the text, His Holiness and Venerable Children use ultimate and conventional. But I don't know if it's quite the same meaning as what we're talking about here. But we'll talk final and provisional tonight. A final object of refuge is a refuge that has completely traversed the path. And a provisional object of refuge is a refuge that has not done so. The final refuge is the final destination we aim to attain by following the path, whereas the provisional refuge helps us to arrive there. In this light, the final refuge is a Buddha having the 4 Buddha bodies. We've gone through those again before. Buddha with these 4 bodies is our final refuge, the final destination that we want to actualize on the path. There is nothing higher than this, all right? So again, regardless of what vehicle we are following, there is one final vehicle according to the Prasangika Madhyamaka school of tenets. That means everyone will eventually enter the Bodhisattva path and become a Buddha. They say it's better if you have some inclination towards the Mahayana to enter it right from the beginning, because otherwise you enter the Hinayana, you culminate that in Arhatship, you leave cyclic existence, and you abide in a mental body for a prolonged period of time in solitary peace. And then you eventually are called back into the Mahayana by some Buddha that you have a connection to. They say, sorry, tell you, you haven't done all the work that needs to be done. There is still work to accomplish, and that's to remove the knowledge obstructions, the obstructions to omniscience, so that you can become a Buddha. So essentially, there's one final result for everyone, every sentient being, and that's, of course, the implication of looking at this topic of Buddha nature. Buddha nature, in a sense, does allow you to attain arhatship, but it's not the final goal. It's not the full nature of your mind to be able to accomplish complete purification of all the adventitious things. When that's accomplished, then you become a Buddha. Until that's accomplished, you still have work to do. You're still on the learning path to some degree. So this is what we're speaking of with regard to these 2 verses, is a final versus a provisional refuge. So first of all, we're going to dismiss that the Dharma jewel and the Sangha jewel can be a final object of refuge. There are 4 reasons that are set out in the verse, and the explanations are on the right-hand side. First, because of being abandoned. Let's look at the description of that. It says the scriptural Dharma jewel is to be abandoned upon the attainment of the result, like a boat. Often they explain the Dharma as being like a boat that gets you to the other shore. Well, when you get to the other shore, you don't need the boat any longer, right? The boat has gotten you there. So the scripture is not to be relied on as a final object of refuge, because it's to be abandoned eventually. We don't need the scripture. Now, it doesn't mean that the Buddhas abandon it in terms of being able to teach it. Of course, they teach it perfectly. That's what a Buddha does. But a Buddha doesn't need to hold on to the Dharma as a sort of final object of refuge, because the Dharma is already actualized in their minds. The realizational Dharma is, within the Buddha's mind already. The second in the verse is because of being deceptive. The description of that pertains now to the true paths. And then this is part of, again, the realizational Dharma. But the true paths here that are being delineated are those in the continuum of a bodhisattva, meaning of an unenlightened being, that appear to actually be undefiled, but still are with defilement. When you are in that meditative equipoise on emptiness, it seems like there is no defilement in the mind because all that is appearing to the mind is emptiness. It is completely pure and free of any conceptualization. So it would seem to be undefiled, but it's deceptive. It isn't completely free yet. You haven't removed all the defilements. It's not until the 10th ground bodhisattva has that final meditative equipoise and they come out of it as a Buddha. They're no longer a bodhisattva or a sentient being at that point. The third in the verse is because of being non-existent. Well, what is this referring to? It's the true cessations, the other element of the Dharma jewel in terms of realization. And then specifically, the nirvana without remainder of a hearer arhat. The nirvana without remainder is, again, when the being has completely left the embodied state and is abiding in that state of solitary peace, is focused on emptiness. Again, they will have a mere absence of suffering and afflictions, yet they're still with the knowledge obstructions. They haven't done the full work, as I was just explaining, right? So even though they will abide in some solitary peace, having attained this nirvana without remainder, they will still not have done all the work. They still are together with those knowledge obstructions. And therefore, the fourth reason, the fourth thing that in pertaining to the Sangha jewel. And then the verse, it says, because of having fear. On the right-hand side, it says the Sangha jewel who are still with the knowledge obstructions, such as here arhats, possess fear due to them. Now, what do we mean by fear? I mean, it's kind of interesting. They do say that there are these sort of residual things that are in the minds of the here arhats and that cause them to engage in kind of very strange behavior. And they do have these things that are documented in the Buddha's teaching. But nonetheless, it's like you're still not completely free of everything. So in that way, there's still some subtle level of fear or something amiss. Because recall that for all of these beings who have not yet removed the knowledge obstructions, when they are not in meditative equipoise on emptiness, there is a false appearance. Everything appears to be real, but it is not. It doesn't exist inherently as it appears. So again, this is why there will be some level of fear or trepidation. Just things are not completely at peace. They've pacified the delusions through attaining nirvana, but they have not yet gotten rid of the knowledge obstructions and the false appearance that arises from them. So then the verse finishes it off by saying, therefore, the two dharmas and the assembly of nobles, the Arya beings in the Sangha, are not the everlasting supreme refuge. Now, if we talked about the Dharma jewel within the continuum of a Buddha, or the Sangha jewel that is an Arya Buddha, a being who is fully enlightened, then it would be included. But again, that's not what we're talking about. That's not the examples that are being given. They are, again, prior to attaining Buddhahood. So then we have the second part of this in regard to ultimate refuge, proving that only a perfect and complete Buddha is the ultimate or final refuge. The verse says, ultimately, the refuge of living beings is solely the Buddha, because the subduer is endowed with the Dharmakaya. The subduer is the finality of the assembly of nobles. So the Dharmakaya is kind of the culmination of the Dharma jewel. The becoming a Buddha then makes, through the Dharmakaya being complete and in one's mental continuum, you become the perfection or the finality of the Sangha, the assembly. So what I've written there on the right-hand side, drawn from the commentary, the ultimate or final refuge is the Buddha jewel. Since the Buddha is endowed with the Dharmakaya that exhausts all fears. They don't say you really have complete fearlessness until you become a Buddha. And that, again, that state of the Dharmakaya is the culmination of the Dharma jewel, the complete realizations, true paths, as well as the complete cessations, true cessations, and is also the finality of the Sangha jewel, because you aren't a perfect Sangha jewel until you attain that state. So again, you're welcome to read the little bits that I've isolated out on each of those verses in Gyaltsab Je's commentary. I just thought it would be kind of using additional time if we went through that time that we could be spending getting into the remainder of the text. Now we have a second little part to this at the end, which is wrapping up the whole topic of the three jewels and the first three Vajra points. And that's the meaning of jewel. Someone asks in the text, well, why are they called jewels? And Maitreya gives this answer. They are jewels for 6 reasons. 1, because they are rarely encountered, because they are stainless, the second reason. They have power, because they're ornaments of the world, because they're excellent, and because they're changeless. Let's look at the explanation of these because it does require some commentary, especially changeless. We might think, well, what does changeless mean? Are they permanent? So in regard to them being designated as jewels, or the Sanskrit is ratna, the Tibetan is kuncho. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche would always translate this as, again, the supreme rare ones. It's sublime rare ones. Sublime rare ones? I think it's supreme rare ones. Anyway, supreme rarity is the connotation of this term. There are 6 qualities of similitude between the 3 refuges and wish-fulfilling jewels. There's this idea of a wish-fulfilling jewel. I'm sure you've heard it before. Let me take it off screen for a moment while I explain it if you haven't. This is a mythical jewel. Whether it really exists or not, who knows? But I mean, we have lots of things in our culture that are similar, right? There's all sorts of fairy tales and things of people finding something that is wish-fulfilling for them, whether it's a genie in a bottle or something magic, that we can get whatever we want in this world. Well, a wish-fulfilling jewel, if it does exist, is supposedly this jewel that you find in the ocean, and you remove it from the water and remove all of the impurities, mud, and what have you that is caked onto it. And then you put it on a flagpole. They say this particular flagpole on a full moon day, the 15th day of the lunar month. And then you make prayers to it, and it will give you whatever you wish in terms of the material world. Now, it's only an example because we actually can attain things beyond the material world, the super mundane accomplishments, when we actually rely upon the 3 jewels. So they're being called like a wish-fulfilling jewel. We use this term frequently to refer to Buddhas, but we also use it even to refer to sentient beings as being like a wish-granting jewel and helping us to accomplish our greatest welfare by becoming a Buddha through relying upon them as a support for our practice of 6 perfections and so on. So again, this is the analogy that we're using. So there are some things that are kind of pertaining to this mythical wish-fulfilling jewel that are similar to the 3 jewels. First, the 3 jewels are like a rare and precious jewel, being difficult to encounter due to their appearance being rare. They don't come into the world so often, and the requisite roots of virtue needed to meet them when they do come in the world. We obviously didn't have the karma to be in the Buddha's retinue at the time when the Buddha appeared in this world. And again, we can say that there are still Buddhas in this world, appearing perhaps as our gurus or other beings in our world. But nonetheless, we have to have a lot of virtue to meet them, and their appearance in the world, particularly as a supreme emanation body, which is what Buddha Shakyamuni was, is very rare. Secondly, they are like a cleaned and polished jewel, just like we take that jewel out of the ocean and we polish it, clean it, make it free of any defects. The jewels themselves are free of the defilements of deception and inability to protect. They all have the ability to protect. Again, we talked about deception earlier being some deceptive qualities, but if they have seen the truth of reality, which is what defines a Dharma, Sangha jewel, and so on, and of course a Buddha has perfected all of that, then they are definitely non-deceptive with regard to the truth that they can teach in regard to their own wisdom. They are thirdly like a jewel that can bestow enjoyments, having the power to benefit sentient beings and fulfill their wishes. And we're going to see this as we get into the text, that Buddhas are said to be there as sort of a resource for us continually, spontaneously even. But we have to rely upon them. But they have that power from their side to help us to attain the enjoyments that we wish through giving us the advice about how to practice so we can have good karma and have good results and enjoyments in our life, what have you. Fourthly, they are like the supreme jewel that is the ornament of the world, being the causes of all that is good, what we often call high status and definite goodness in the world. So when we talk about ornamenting the world, we mean kind of giving something very beautiful to the world. But what do we get from the 3 jewels? What is it that they want us to achieve? High status, which means attaining a good rebirth through the teachings on karma and attending to them and so on, but through the attaining high status to eventually attain what is called definite goodness. Definite goodness refers to both individual liberation, attaining one's own nirvana through arhatship, as well as Buddhahood, which is the supreme goal of definite goodness. We could summarize everything that the Buddha taught in terms of those. Recall in the Lam Rim, we have those three encapsulated. High status is the goal of the first level of the Lam Rim. Definite goodness in terms of self-liberation is the goal of the middle path. And then, of course, the great scope, the great capacity is for attaining the definite goodness that is Buddhahood. Number 5, they are like jewels that are superior to fake ones, being unequaled and supramundane. So, we would never mistake them for being kind of fake or, not the real deal. We would definitely know that they have an unequaled quality to them and they're beyond the world. Recall last week we got into that whole idea of the delineation between, Tony was bringing this up, superior being and an ordinary being. So anything that is on the other line that is crossed over due to having attained the path of seeing, whether it be on the fundamental vehicle or the Mahayana vehicle path, they will be a Sangha jewel and have the Dharma jewel in their continuum. They have gone beyond the world. They have attained a supramundane wisdom and have developed uncontaminated karma. So in that way, they are unequal to the ordinary beings, and they are beyond them in terms of their abilities and realization. Number 6, they are like jewels that are constant in their qualities. This is what we mean here by kind of, unchanging. They're not changing in their actions of refuge, regardless of praise or criticism and so forth. So they say in particular with the Buddha, though obviously I would hope that most Sangha jewels that aren't Buddhas would also have the same ability, that if they are criticized by somebody or praised by somebody, they don't delineate and discriminate and say, oh, well, I'll help this being, but not that being. That they would have an unchanging dedication to helping others in terms of achieving realizations and accomplishing them. Now, again, the hearers in solitary realizers, as I mentioned, they do have some level of compassionate concern. They practice the 4 immeasurables. They just don't practice great compassion and great love that leads to bodhicitta. So they wouldn't have all of the reliability when it comes to some of that, but they do still have, again, the fundamental qualities that make them a worthy object of refuge to be relied upon. So, and all 3 jewels have these likenesses to the wish-fulfilling jewel. So that concludes this section. So in the commentary, we're already up through page 74, and I haven't covered a number of the pages in there. So I would really discourage you from just kind of going through this and, picking it all apart. You're going to run into passages that are going to be a little more difficult. You certainly, if you are really adventurous, you're welcome to do so. But I won't really have time to go back and answer questions on passages that I didn't cover in terms of the commentary that I did share with you from this first part. I will probably cover much more of the commentary going forward. But even tonight, there will be a few bits that I leave out. And in most classes, there probably will be a few. Sometimes when it gets to going back to scripture and kind of tying things to the sutras, this just gets a little tedious. And I just find that it's better for us to stay focused on the material at hand. The very next chapter of Gyaltsabte's commentary, again, these aren't the chapters that we originally spoke of in regard to Maitreya's text. Maitreya's text, again, has 4 chapters. We are studying chapter 1, which includes all 4 of the first Vajra topics. Then we have the last 3 topics, each with a chapter themselves in terms of Maitreya's text, and that part we will not be studying. So if we go to chapter 3 on page 75, we see that we're going to have a reiteration of this whole idea of the remaining 4 Vajra topics as all being the causes and conditions that lead to accomplishing the 3 resultant jewels. So let me pull this up once more. Most of you have already spent some time with this chart on the, whoops, I hit the button before it had, sorry about that. As I told you before, there's this issue with where the little menu bar is up at the top, and I have to be able to get to, there we go. Nope, now it keeps coming down when my cursor goes up. Okay, please go up. All right, now stay up. There we go. Okay, this is the 7 Vajra points. This is, again, the chart that we started with towards the very beginning of this discussion. going through this course. Remember that the first three are the resultant three jewels that we want to attain. The fourth of the seven Vajra topics is the main topic for the remainder of this text that we're studying for the remainder of chapter 1. This is the substantial cause that will bring about one's own achievement, the basis for one to achieve the desired goal of becoming the Buddha jewel, and by virtue of that, the perfect Dharma and Sangha jewel. Again, that's what we call the basic element, or Buddha nature, or Buddha potential, or lineage. Then we have the cooperative causes, the things that assist us, that aid us in accomplishing that. But the main cause is our Buddha nature. These are enlightenment, meaning other enlightened beings who influence us through their qualities that they possess, the sixth of these Vajra topics, as well as the activities that they engage in. So I think that's good enough to get us back into these topics that we're going to be looking at in these verses here in this section. So we have a link. A link is oftentimes just to get us from what was just discussed to what we're going to discuss now. This is the section immediately following the teaching on the resultant three jewels. The basis of all worldly good and all supermundane purity are the three jewels themselves. And the following verses are based on the causes and conditions for the creation of those three jewels. In other words, for them to be your resultant state. We have first verse 23. This delineates four kind of points that are kind of involved in how inconceivable it is to be able to fully fathom these remaining 4 points, 4 Vajra points. Remember, Vajra is being used because these are all very profound topics. The first one, suchness with stains. Well, what is that referring to? That's the Buddha nature that we have, right? It's the emptiness of the mind together with stain. Enlightenment without stains. That's the fifth of the Vajra topics. That's the state of Buddhahood. Other beings who have attained that, who no longer have any stains in their mind. Undefiled excellent qualities of the Buddha. These are the sixth topic, the Vajra point pertaining to the excellent qualities of these enlightened beings. And then their activities, their deeds, the deeds of the conqueror. Those causes and conditions from which the virtuous three jewels arise are the objects of those who realize the ultimate. In other words, they're not really realized fully until one is a Buddha jewel. When you are a Buddha, then you have a complete cognition of what those topics really are, what the excellent qualities of the Buddhas are, the deeds and activities, as well as, of course, enlightenment itself, the knowledge of that. And then, of course, the knowledge of Buddha nature in its fullness. So, suchness with stains is the valid substantial cause, Gyaltsab Je says. Contributory causes can be summarized as enlightenment without stains, the undefiled qualities of the Buddha, and the activities of the conqueror. Again, the fifth, sixth, and seventh of the 7 Vajra points. From these causes and conditions, the goal of the 3 virtuous jewels, the first 3 Vajra points, will arise. This will be explained. Here, virtuous means excellent. The above are objects of knowledge of those in whom all is perfected, referring to the Buddhas who see the ultimate. I mean, it's not saying that we can't understand these to some degree, because we can. We're studying it and hopefully gain some comprehension of what these Vajra points are. But to know them in their fullness, one has to be a Buddha to do that. So now we have this explanation. So what is this verse explaining then? The answer is under 2 headings. First, that these cannot be conceived by beings, again, who are not Buddhas. They are solely objects of knowledge of Buddhas, again, in their deepest level. It's very difficult to comprehend. And then we're going to look at how inconceivability is established. This is a little bit of a dense section, but I'm going to try to go through it in a way that we can get our heads around it. First, in verse 24, is kind of reiterating that these 4 are inconceivable by way of a specific reason pertaining to them. Verse 24 says, the 3 jewels and its lineage are objects only of those all-seeing ones. These 4 aspects, in their respective order, are inconceivable by way of 4 reasons. So we're going to again see this explained out in verse 25 in particular. The commentary on verse 24 says the complete concordant causes and conditions that produce the resultant 3 jewels are objects of knowledge of the direct realization of the all-knowing Buddhas. These causes and conditions by 4 facts in sequence, meaning by 4 reasons that will be explained later, very shortly, are inconceivable in their totality to the direct realization of others and are therefore objects of knowledge for the Buddhas alone. The previous verse identifies the four causes and conditions and teaches for whom they are objects of knowledge. This verse, meaning that was verse 23, this verse 24 teaches that there are reasons why they are objects of knowledge for the Buddhas. So we're going to have a brief commentary on each of these that we will go through, and then we'll go on to verse 25. Suchness with stains, that's the first of these four that are mentioned. Again, that's the fourth Vajra point, Buddha nature. Suchness with stains is the basic element not liberated from the obscurations of mental afflictions and is known as Tathagata essence. By nature, it is pure and is the ultimate truth. Remember that again. This is when we talk about Buddha nature, what is the ultimate Buddha nature? It is the emptiness of the mind that is with stain. The conventional Buddha nature, the developmental Buddha nature, is the mind that can develop all these qualities, that changes over time. The unchanging nature of the mind is its emptiness. It is by nature pure, meaning it lacks any afflictions whatsoever. It has that clear light nature. And it is the ultimate truth of emptiness. It has that emptiness quality. The term Tathagata essence is not used anywhere. Gyaltsab is going to make this point a number of times. Used anywhere by either the Tathagata Essence Sutra, that is the original origin of these teachings, or this treatise and its commentary, which explain the thinking of that sutra to teach the twofold purity. Here, the twofold purity is the Buddhahood, where we have attained the purity of the both of the adventitious stains, the afflictive obstructions and the knowledge obstruction. Sometimes he used twofold purity in a different way, right? We talk about how you have the natural purity and the adventitious purity. That's not how it's being used here. Twofold purity here is referring to Buddhahood, where you have purity of both levels of afflictions or of obstructions, afflictive obstructions and knowledge obstruction. So the idea here is that you can't take Tathagata essence and say it's referring to the resultant state where you have that twofold purity. Tathagata essence is only referring to Buddha nature, which is suchness with defilement, with stain. Even though it still has natural purity, it has suchness, it is still stained. The mind of that being is still stained. So going on to the commentary, it says, therefore, to apply the ultimate Dharmakaya to Tathagata essence, to equate those two, is a mere fabrication and should not be applied to the tradition of this treatise. And apparently there are passages in some sutras that say that. So it says to use other sutras that speak of the Tathagata essence, referring to the Dharmakaya, pure of defilement, as scriptural support for this view, merely shows one's ignorance of reasoning. Now remember, we've got this idea that, and this is what we spoke of earlier in the course as well, Buddha nature exists in a sentient being from beginningless time, because the mind has no beginning. It has always been there, the suchness of the mind along with the mind. It will continue until you get to that point. In the last moment of a sentient being, when you generate that wisdom realizing emptiness, and you have the uninterrupted path, that's the last moment of that Buddha nature. The next moment becomes the Dharmakaya, the Buddha's purified mind. So we don't have Buddha nature any longer when you're a Buddha. You have the Dharmakaya, you have the full state of the Buddha jewel. So to say that Tathagata essence is referring to both of those would be a mistake. The essence of the Tathagata, the seed, the womb of the Tathagata exists up to this point, and then Tathagata exists afterward. Tathagata is fine to refer to the Dharmakaya and so on, but to use the Tathagata essence to refer to that would be a mistake. And that's just to this point. And as I said, it's going to be made a couple more times. That was the first topic pertaining to Buddha nature. Now we're going to talk about enlightenment, which is called suchness without stain, meaning the emptiness of the mind without any defilements. It has natural purity, but moreover, it has adventitious purity. So what this is referring to, we call it enlightenment, but we're kind of highlighting the nature truth body, right? The state or the freedom from all levels of defilements that is together with the mind of a Buddha. All right. So it says suchness without stains means that suchness with stains has exhausted all defilement and has developed into the level of enlightenment and is known as the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata. Someone may come up with an argument and say, oh, that's completely wrong. You're saying that suchness with stains is suchness without stain. And it's kind of a weird way of interpreting what was just said. because it's not saying that, but that's what Gyaltsen is going to correct. You do have a suchness that exists prior to Buddhahood, which is with stains, and you have a suchness that exists after Buddhahood that is without stain. But that suchness is the same, but not the same in terms of the basis. The basis that that suchness is together with, the mind of a being who is unenlightened, which has stains, is different than the mind of a being who is enlightened, that is without stain. So actually, he's saying here, the person could be saying, you're saying that suchness with stains is suchness without stains. Gyaltsab says this is just prattle that lacks a thorough understanding of reasoning. Aren't we saying that suchness with stains completely transformed is the Dharmakaya? If not, it would follow that sentient beings are Buddhas, because sentient beings with all defilements eliminated are Buddhas. I mean, we have to be kind of delineating, is this is a different suchness? It's a continuation of the emptiness of the mind, but the suchness is now together with a mind without stain. Before that, it is a mind with stains. Otherwise, you run into that fault, because you would have suchness without stains, even when it's a being that is unenlightened. Therefore, B should be in there, it can be accepted that suchness with stains is the Tathagata essence, Buddha nature, and that suchness completely divorced from defilement is the Dharmakaya. There's no contradiction at all in saying that the Tathagata essence is not the Dharmakaya, while at the same time asserting that suchness with stains, when all defilement is eliminated, is the Dharmakaya. Wasn't saying the same thing. If it were not possible for suchness with stains to become divorced from defilement, one would have to conclude that it would not be possible for sentient beings to become Buddhas. Or he uses an example of a piece of white cloth to be dyed to become red. This argument shows no real understanding of aggregate continuity, the continuity of the mind, and ultimately comes down to the belief in an unchanging but functional phenomenon found in that tradition. Again, what one teacher, I can't remember which Geshe's commentary I mentioned, he said that essentially this is speaking to the fact that many lower schools want to, particularly even some of the non-Buddhist schools, want to adhere to some sort of permanent essence that is the person, that goes from life to life, that is the experiencer of the karmic effects of what one creates in one life so that they ripen on the same being in another life, and essentially kind of adhering to some distorted view. And so essentially, if you don't have any inherent essence, some sort of essential thing that goes from life to life, you always have the emptiness of that, the suchness of that. And those schools they'd have a problem with it. Even the lower Buddhist schools, again, have a problem with saying that there isn't some sort of inherently existent person that goes from life to life, some sort of essence that is the person. Well, there's the mind that goes from life to life, but that mind is not the inherent essence of a sentient being. It is only a continuity of mind that is labeled as certain persons in various lifetimes and so on. I don't want to get into all of that proof of why there is no inherently existent person. But essentially, this is saying that you're not understanding correctly what's going on in terms of the continuity of mind and the suchness that is together with that then becomes the suchness without stains when that mind goes on in a purified state. So this is, again, kind of looking at things from the suchness without stains point of view, whereas the first one was looking at it from the point of view of suchness with stains. Commentary continues with delineating the other 2 points. This is, again, the 6th Vajra point, the undefiled qualities of a Buddha. They exist in dependence on the Dharmakaya, characterized by being the complete transformation of the mind of suchness with stains into a mind of suchness without stain. Again, this word transformation is weird because it's not that the suchness actually sort of changes, because it is a permanent phenomenon. Suchness is an unchanging phenomenon, but the mind of the being changes, and thereby we can say there is suchness with stains prior to that, suchness without stains after it. And the qualities arise upon attaining Buddhahood when one has that suchness of the mind without stains. Gyaltsab continues, he says, these are the dharmas of Buddhas, qualities of eradication, completely purified and fully ripened qualities, fully developed, such as the 10 supramundane powers, the 18 unshared qualities of the Buddha, the 4 fearlessnesses, and so on. I mean, there's different ways the Buddha's qualities are delineated, but we could say the Buddha's qualities are infinite. Again, we've already spoken to that prior to this. That's the 3rd of these that are delineated in this verse, verse 23, and that's the sixth Vajra point. The seventh Vajra point are the deeds or the activities of the Buddhas, the conquerors. This refers to the 32 sublime activities found in each of the qualities of Buddha, such as the 10 qualities. Due to having these various powers, one can then manifest that in activities of speech and so on that benefit sentient beings. They are enlightened activities spontaneously arising and therefore do not disappear. Recall that I mentioned this earlier. Buddhists don't have conceptions about what they are going to do. They don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, this is a good day to work on helping Lou on his path, and so they try to do all these things for Lou. And they think, oh, well, now I've spent that day on Lou, maybe I'll spend the next day on Stephen, So they instead are this perpetual, force in the world that is shining out enlightened activities faultlessly. Where are the faults in us not receiving them or not benefiting from them or not being able to utilize them to their greatest capacity? Faults are on our side. So this continuum, as it says there, is stable, and therefore they are without interruption. Because they are constantly engaged, their stream will never be broken. There's never an end to the Buddha's enlightened activities. Therefore, the flow of Bodhisattva prophecy will never be severed. This is just an illustration. The commentary continues, these four bases are inconceivable. Da, da, da. So this is kind of what we're going to look at in verse 25, is why are they called inconceivable? We can conceive them, as I said earlier, to some degree by going through the reasoning that is being set out in this text. We can gain some conceptual understanding of them, but it's very difficult to get some of these points, I find especially that last one. And how is it that a Buddha becomes sort of a perpetually turning the wheel of Dharma, engaging in enlightened activities, constantly doing this from their side? Like the culmination of everything done on the Bodhisattva path ripens into that. And it's amazing. I mean, there's no stopping it. There's nothing that will ever cease that. It's like a self-perpetuating engine. Well, we have these hybrid automobiles now, right, that they've gained some ability to keep themselves going through. They're going. I mean, this is kind of what the Buddhas are doing. They're like continually involved in activities to benefit others. And by virtue of that, they just keep creating more and more of that same energy. The energy is all there intact. It's just, kind of manifesting in that way. So again, it's the faults are on the side of sentient beings as to whether or not they experience that. So now we go into verse 25, which gives these reasons why we could say that each of these four Vajra points are very difficult to fathom, if not completely inconceivable. They're at least very hard to get. One, because the basic element is pure and yet has afflictions. Oops, sorry. Being over here. Sorry, you at home who had to deal with that. The first one has to do with the idea that it's difficult to reconcile what we call the natural purity of the mind with the stains of the mind that are there adventitiously. So if the mind is naturally pure, why does it have stains in it? It's kind of like, it does get into that thinking that some people do express, well, how did this all start? Where did the impurity come from? If the mind is naturally pure, why has it had these adventitious stains since the beginning of time? The second is pertaining to enlightenment itself, because enlightenment, on the other hand, which is again suchness without stains, is thoroughly without afflictions, and yet, still involves some purification in order to accomplish it. We still do have to purify the mind to get there. Once more, this is kind of looking at just two different points of view. The first one was suchness with stains, which is our Buddha nature. Enlightenment, suchness without stains. And they both become a bit inconceivable because you're just looking at it from two different points of view. One, how can something that has natural purity have adventitious faults? And secondly, how can something that will be the complete freedom of all of that, how can it have that purity without having had faults from the beginning? It's kind of, again, examining that we would still need to be purified, even though those defilements and afflictions were there previously. You still have to go through a process of purification. The natural purity alone is not enough to remove that. We still have to engage in the path to have that, attain that state of enlightenment through removing that. We're going to see a little more of the explanation of that when we get into the commentary. Thirdly, because the excellent qualities, again, the sixth Vajra point, are undifferentiable. Well, how are they undifferentiable? They're undifferentiable in terms of their suchness. You know, the minds of the sentient beings who possess defilements and the minds of sentient beings who are, I'm sorry, of beings who are fully enlightened, the Buddhas, those minds are both together with suchness. They both are empty of inherent existence. They're undifferentiable. So whether we talk about excellent qualities or we talk about the kind of half-baked qualities that all of us have, the afflictions as well as all the other things that we have in our minds, these are undifferentiable in terms of their suchness. We don't see any uh, degree of difference there. It's only the degree of difference in terms of what is the contents of our minds versus the contents of the mind of a Buddha. Again, the qualities that they possess. And then lastly, the seventh Vajra point, because the deeds are spontaneous and non-conceptual. So this again gets into that kind of really difficult to fathom point, which is how is it that Buddha's activities can continually be set out in the world and without any ceasing, without any impulse to start them? When you attain enlightenment, again, you don't start thinking, oh, now what should I do now that I'm a Buddha? You immediately are manifesting for the benefit of beings to the degree that their karma will allow you to experience that. Recall once more the story of Maitreya and Asanga that I mentioned at the very beginning of this course. Asanga had to wait until he spent 12 years in meditation retreat and had purified his mind enough and developed this immense great compassion to where he saw this, dog with maggots on the wound on its rear quarters, and he decided that he had to help that thing, and he had to help it in a very profound way. Then Maitreya appeared. So again, we have these two forces in the world, the enlightened beings that are constantly trying to get us, and then we have our own karma that we have to continually be working on to develop the merit and the ability to benefit from the presence of these beings in our world and in our influence or sphere of influence. As I mentioned previously, Tsongkhapa, I think I mentioned it here, Tsongkhapa had a vision of Maitreya, Manjushri, had a vision of Manjushri that was his guru manifesting in that perfect form. He wouldn't have attained that had he not been able to, purify his obstacles through deep practices of purification, as well as attaining great meritorious stores of potential so that he could actually accomplish that. So let's look at what it says here in this initial commentary. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Trying to get on the little down arrow. Okay. So the natural purity of the minds of sentient beings, which refers to the naturally pure suchness with defilement, is nevertheless possessed of mental affliction. This is the first of these four. The basic element is pure naturally, but yet it has adventitious stains, afflictions. One cannot conceive of these two coming together in one place. It's kind of hard for our minds to say if there's natural purity there, why are there adventitious stains? Therefore, it is difficult to comprehend. Because the suchness without defilement, this is the second one, was never previously afflicted and yet in time is purified of defilement, it is difficult to comprehend. So we've always had natural purity, right? Because there's natural purity with our minds right now. It never was previously afflicted, but yet it still had to be purified of defilement in order to attain that state. So once more, we're just looking at it from the vantage point of the resultant state. When you achieve the resultant state, even though the natural purity was the same prior to that, you had to have the adventitious purity. You had to remove the stains in order to accomplish that state. Thirdly, the undefiled qualities are undefiled, and yet from the point of view of their nature, they are undifferentiated from the wholly afflicted mind streams of ordinary being. Right? The natural purity is the same of these qualities. We could talk about the 10 supermundane powers of a Buddha. They are empty of inherent existence as well. They have no difference in their suchness versus the suchness or the emptiness of our anger, our attachment, what have you. Again, all of these qualities of the mind, because they are a phenomenon that exists, are empty of inherent existence. They have the same nature of being undifferentiated from the qualities of a Buddha in their suchness. Therefore, they are difficult to comprehend. And then fourth, because the activities of the conqueror are spontaneous and non-conceptual in their execution, they are difficult to comprehend. And it's difficult for us to get our heads around, again, the fact that this is how Buddhas are able to benefit sentient beings. Now we're going to go into a bit of the commentary. I won't cover all of this, but I think it's good to review a little bit and get words of Gyaltsen in our minds to understand each of these four difficulties, kind of the reasoning that sets it out, why we can say they're difficult to comprehend or inconceivable. Again, we can gain some knowledge of them through doing this, but we can't know them in their full quality. First one, suchness with defilement, which once again is our Buddha nature. This is the natural emptiness of the minds of sentient beings. No sentient beings, again, have some level of obstruction or defilement with them. This is naturally pure, and at the same time, the minds of sentient beings are contaminated with mental affliction. Again, mental affliction is being used as shorthand there for any, obstruction in the mind, because even once you've got rid of the afflictive obstructions, when you enter the pure grounds, the bodhisattvas still have the contamination of the knowledge obstructions. Therefore, this is difficult to conceive. This means that if the mind is contaminated by mental affliction, we must accept the cause and effect process of contaminator and the contaminated. This makes its emptiness nature very difficult to understand. If you've got this whole contamination process going on of the mind being contaminated and the contaminations in the mind, well, then how can the mind be naturally pure? It is difficult to understand the two truths as having a common basis, emptiness and the conventional truth that is together with that base. Because there is no trace of anything existing by its own nature, and yet activity is valid. Similarly, it is difficult to understand the emptiness by nature of the minds of sentient beings alongside suchness with defilement. To see these two, the emptiness of the nature of the minds, but we still have defilement with the mind. With their faith in the profound dharma of emptiness free of fabrication, this is a topic not even within the scope of the solitary realizers. This means not being in the scope of their self-generated wisdom. To assert that they do not perceive it at all contradicts scripture. Again, we can say that at various levels we increase our awareness of these profound topics, but we don't have the perfect knowledge of them that a Buddha possesses until later. We're going to skip again many of these connections to scripture. The second difficulty, the difficulty of comprehending suchness without stain. Again, this is referring to the fifth logic point, enlightenment, the Dharmakaya, the mind of a Buddha that has been purified. And of course, we're primarily here looking at the suchness, the nature truth body, that is the natural purity together with the adventitious purity. Suchness without defilement was never previously afflicted by defilement, because the mental afflictions of desire and so forth cannot focus upon suchness. If we say that suchness is the means by which one purifies the mind, and the suchness of that we as being realized is a undefiled phenomenon, well then afflictions can't be looking at suchness. Afflictions are always together with ignorance. They're always together with a misconception. So we never have any real defilement of the mind in terms of its natural purity, but nonetheless, we still will have to purify the mind of those defilements that are there adventitiously. Goes on to say, Gyaltsen says, this is because a state of mind that seeks to focus on suchness must become a mind whose nature is virtue, and so cannot be a mental affliction. When we develop the mind of virtue, that is the wisdom realizing emptiness, then the wisdom realizing suchness is present, and we see the natural purity of the mind. And by virtue of that, we begin the process of removing the afflictions and the obscurations, obstructions in the mind. But we can't say that there's a mental affliction there, because mental afflictions, again, don't observe suchness. Mental afflictions cannot be present because at that time we are observing ultimate truth. We are observing emptiness. Likewise, this can be understood if one examines the mode of apprehension of the mental afflictions also. And when we see that the mental afflictions are always mistakenly adhering to an inherently existent object. We have the inherently existent eye that we are thinking of in regard to an inherently existent taste, for example, and then the process of action of tasting that object and so on. All of this is together with the afflictions. Our mode of apprehension is together with an afflicted mind that is not seeing the wisdom of suchness. Okay, so I think that's, let me look at my text and make sure because there were some passages that I and decided I was not going to go through the book. I'm going to go through the rest of this. For a mind to be contaminated with mental afflictions, these mental afflictions are able to focus on the mind, where they become of one entity with afflicted states of mind surrounding the mental consciousness. Not sure what that quite means, but again, it's just saying that this is what happens when the afflictions are present. You don't have any ability to see suchness. Some might ask, if the afflictions do not focus upon suchness, then isn't it contradictory to say that suchness can be defiled? So if we're saying that the suchness is undefiled or is with defilement, well then if afflictions are not focusing on suchness, then how is suchness defiled? Again, because we're talking about two different things here. Suchness itself is undefiled naturally, but it's with the adventitious purities that are in the mind. So again, this is what's going to be explained here. When mind is contaminated by affliction, if the empty nature of this mind were not obscured, then it would be directly perceivable, right? But it is, because our perception is obscured by defilements. Therefore, it is not seen. So this is what is meant by suchness with defilement, that there's suchness of our minds, the emptiness of our minds, but because defilement is present, we don't see that suchness. We don't see the emptiness of the mind. We have to have a virtuous mind of wisdom realizing emptiness in order to accomplish. So some might reply, in that case, suchness without stains must also be defiled, because if it is free of obscuring defilement, even ordinary beings would see it directly. However, because it is obscured by the defilements present in the perception of ordinary beings, it is not seen. So yes, you're not seeing the suchness that is without defilement, but nonetheless, without stains is very different. And we can't say that it has any defilement because, again, it's free of adventitious defilement. This gets to be, I'm going to take it off screen for a moment because these words start to all blend together. Let's go back to getting grounded in it. We have, again, natural purity on both sides of the fence. Prior to attaining Buddhahood, that natural purity is there. We call that suchness with stains because the mind still has stains. After we attain enlightenment, we call it suchness without stain because that natural purity now is still there, but it has an additional level of purity, which is the purity that is the freedom from the adventitious stain. So we're just simply delineating it in terms of whether it is with the stains that are there adventitiously or without the stains that are there adventitiously. The emptiness of the mind is the same, regardless of the qualities in the mind, whether the mind has these stains or is without them. So I'm going to skip over, I think, some of this other because it just starts to become, again, a lot of words to get at the same point. The final one that's in the center of the screen there, because over time the mind is purified of these adventitious defilements, these two bases existing together are inconceivable, meaning they're difficult to comprehend. Again, I don't know how difficult these are when we start studying them, but to get them again at their full import, to really understand that suchness, and of course to know it the way it exists, does require a mind realizing emptiness directly at least. But we have a difficulty once more of reconciling that suchness is a natural purity, and yet there's a point where we have defilement and then a point where we no longer have defilement. But once more, those are the adventitious defilements. There are no natural stains. Remember, I went through that slide quite a few weeks ago, a couple weeks ago. Natural stains do not exist. So there is always freedom from natural stains. It's just this freedom from adventitious stains that becomes the delineating point between the suchness prior to Buddhahood and the suchness after Buddhahood. So it's, again, the text is going to use suchness quite a bit. Suchness is the same as thusness, as emptiness, as selflessness. All of these are synonyms for that same quality. All right, now we're on to the third one, the difficulty of comprehending undefiled qualities. That again, the qualities too are together with a natural purity, even though qualities of a sentient being, whatever they might be, are also together with that suchness. These undefiled qualities of a Buddha have the same suchness, that same natural purity, even though we can say the minds of those two beings are very different. Qualities of those beings are very different. The statement, this section, the undefiled qualities of the Buddha are undefiled naturally, right? And yet, from the point of view of their nature, I guess undefiled naturally and adventitious, we would say for the Buddha. Yet, from the point of view of their nature, their reality is that they're undifferentiated, either before or after from even the levels of ordinary beings with their wholly afflicted mind. This, therefore, is inconceivable. Again, the point that I just made. I don't keep saying it again. The mind of a sentient being that's together with afflictions, its suchness is the same as the suchness of the mind of a Buddha with all these amazing qualities, because the natural purity is the same. Over here on the side of the Buddhas, we do have another level of purity, of being without stain. But that, again, is due to the adventitious stains being gone. This means that just as it is difficult to see how blue and yellow can be undifferentiated, it is difficult to comprehend how suchness isolated from all stains is undefiled, and yet from the point of view of its nature is indistinguishable from suchness with defilement. Okay. So again, I think I'm going to skip over this next section because it starts getting pretty heady and into all these things about the Dharmakaya and all that. Connection to scripture, examples and things. If we go forward, where would I want to go to? We're up to page, let's go all the way up to the fourth quality, which is page 83. All right. Again, I'm sorry I'm skipping some of these because I know some teachers will go through some of this if they're going to teach on this part of the text. But nonetheless, I do feel like we get really bogged down in a lot of detail in scripture passages that if you're getting the basic point of it, which is again, this undifferentiability of suchness, that's what all three of these, the first three, have had to do with. They're right at some level, but the natural purity is still there, regardless of what is going on in the transformation of a particular being's mind. From the vantage point of it first being Buddha nature, from the vantage point of it being enlightenment, and then from the vantage point of the qualities that one has in enlightenment. Now we're going to look at this last topic, the seventh Vajra point, which is a fourth one of our difficulties. Difficulty of comprehending the activities of a Buddha. Again, these spontaneous, effortless activities. The meaning that's set out says here, at the same time and at all times, to all disciples, spontaneously and without effort, without the conceptuality of preceding thought, whatever the mentality of disciples and whatever the merit of the disciples, the activities of the Buddha engage fully and harmoniously with sentient beings. Because of this, the activities of the Buddha cannot be conceived. I get that this is a pretty hard one, as I said earlier, to fathom, because how is this happening? I mean, it does take some faith that this is what will occur when we attain Buddhahood, that all of that meritorious energy and wisdom will manifest in continually, without stop, effortlessly manifesting for the benefit of all beings. We have a connection to scripture, which I'm not going to go through. That concludes these four topics. Again, that's good enough, I think, for our purposes to go through what was in verses 23 through 25. Now we're going to have a sort of presentation of which of these are the main causes, a substantial cause, and which are simply cooperative conditions. Verse 26 says, the basic element, again, Buddha nature, that is to be realized, the realization, enlightenment, that's the next topic, the branches of the exalted qualities of the Buddha, that's again the sixth Vajra point, and the activities that are for the sake of realization in the minds of others. In this order of four, the first point is the cause, the substantial cause. The other three are conditions for purification. So again, I think we all know this idea of substantial cause versus conditions. Substantial cause is the raw stuff from which something will eventually be formed. When we use something like pot, well then the substantial cause is the clay that was fired and first formed into the pot and then fired so it could become the pot and so on. You need the substantial cause as the main thing that becomes the effect. But the effect doesn't happen without cooperative conditions. You need the potter and the wheel and the water and everything else involved in creating it, and of course the fire and the kiln and everything, and then all the elements, of course the potter themselves. Those are all cooperative conditions. You can't get to the result of the pot without them, but the main cause is the clay from which the pot is formed. Okay, so in a similar way, the main cause of achieving Buddhahood, the Dharmakaya, the full wisdom of a Buddha together with its nature truth body, is the mind of a sentient being that is currently with defilement. our own minds that have that. That's the main cause, the substantial cause. Now, again, we talked about two elements of the Buddha nature, naturally abiding Buddha nature, as well as the development. The naturally abiding is the emptiness of that mind. That is not a changing phenomenon. Therefore, it technically cannot be a cause. But we do call it a cause by virtue of that is what allows for the mind to develop, is that it lacks any inherent existence. But furthermore, it's often pointed out too that that is the object that one realizes in order to attain enlightenment, right? The main progression through the Bodhisattva path, through the 10 grounds and so on, is through realizing emptiness that acts as the antidote to another layer of obstruction. So by realizing the suchness of the mind, the suchness of all phenomena, suchness becomes the object by which the effect is created. So we can call it a cause in that respect too. It is the object that we are realizing that causes the progression all the way to Buddha. So the first of these four, the fourth topic, Buddha nature, that is the main topic for the remainder of the text. This is the substantial cause. The other three are the cooperative conditions. These are the fifth, sixth, and seventh Vajra topics because we need to come into contact with enlightened beings, such as Buddha Shakyamuni, even, who appeared in this world and began turning the wheel of Dharma. We are in the sphere of his influence, his qualities that continue to play out in terms of the Dharma being in this world and so on. The teachings that he gave, the activities of the Buddhas. And of course, when we enlarge upon this to include our gurus and others in the world who might be enlightened beings that we encounter, we see that we are under the influence of these beings without a doubt. All right, so let's go into just a brief commentary on this. This is on the next page, page 84. I'm just going to cover this top part of it, which, let's see, did I go too far? Let's see, I did. Okay, so the phenomenon to be realized is the suchness with defilement, Buddha nature. If it is directly realized, all Buddha qualities will be created. Again, if we realize the emptiness of the mind, that changes our mind, that becomes the causes and conditions for us to be able to attain enlightenment. The main cause being our own minds and the suchness of our minds that allow for enlightenment to eventually occur. If it is not directly realized, there is no freedom even from samsara, right? We even need that to attain liberation for ourselves. This is what is to be ascertained. The ultimate phenomenon to be realized is this one base or basic element, which is a purifying cause, bringing about the eradication of defilement. This is again what I just explained. It is true that it is not by definition a cause that creates the exalted wisdom of a Buddha, because suchness isn't an impermanent phenomenon. It's not a cause that leads to an effect. However, as the focus of the exalted wisdom of meditative equipoise of the Arya Bodhisattvas, which is the main cause of the exalted wisdom of a Buddha, and as the indispensable reason for the arising of a Buddha's exalted wisdom, it's being labeled a cause. Okay? Again, that was pretty much everything that I just said. The three bases or conditions for the removing of the defilements are enlightenment as the ultimate direct realization of suchness, the final goal that someone else has attained that becomes a guiding light for us. The qualities of the Buddha as the limbs of that enlightenment, the 32 qualities as they're set out, the 18 unshared, the 10 powers, and so on. And the enlightened deeds, the activities, the seventh Vajra point, as the qualities of the Buddha that lead the three kinds of disciples to perceive suchness. Therefore, the suchness within the continuum of the intended disciple of the Uttara Tantra is the substantial base, whereas enlightenment and so forth, which are objects of causal refuge already developed in a continuum other than oneself, are the three conditions. So that concludes that section. We're not going to go into the remainder of that. Let me just take it off screen for a moment and just reiterate the points of that. And this goes back to when we initially talked about the Vajra points. But the last four are the causes for attaining the three resultant jewels in your own continuum. You absolutely require the main cause, the substantial cause, which is the Buddha nature. Here delineated primarily as the suchness of the mind, because that's the ultimate Buddha nature, but nonetheless includes the developmental nature, which allows the mind to develop into the wisdom truth body and thereby become the form bodies of the Buddha. But you also need the three cooperative conditions. You need the enlightenment of other beings. You need those beings with their qualities complete. And then, of course, you need their enlightened activities, which are spontaneous and effortless. That's why we can become a Buddha. That's what we're going to be examining to some degree as we get into the remainder of the text. I'm going to just briefly go back to some slides that I forgot to share because I think they're kind of important. Nonetheless, you have copies of these so you can read them on your own as well. Let me go forward with the ones that I had delineated for tonight. Oops. A couple more quotes from Following in the Buddha's Footsteps. First of all, I just wanted to give some impetus as to why we took some time to look at the qualities of the three jewels. But enumerating those demonstrates why they're trustworthy and complete sources of refuge. Since we have the fortune to encounter such reliable objects of refuge, it is important that we take refuge in them fully from the depths of our hearts and to take refuge repeatedly in order to deepen and strengthen our connection with them. Doing this will enable us to call on their guidance no matter what situations we face in life or when we are dying. This passage mainly speaks to the causal refuge components. But this is one reason why, again, studying this text is helpful, and there is no fault in looking at the first three Vajra points as causal refuge too. But in this context, they're set up definitely as a resultant refuge. And that is spoken to some degree here in this next part. Speaking of the three jewels and of the final and provisional refuges in such detail, emphasizes the unique qualities of the Buddhas, the total purity and clarity of their minds, the full abandonments and realizations possessed only by the fully awakened ones. Seeing this, first, our faith in the Buddha increases. That's the causal refuge kind of component, as does our determination to become a Buddha ourselves. So hopefully the time we spent tonight and in previous classes looking at that, we can funnel that into that idea of strengthening our causal refuge because we see the Buddha as a completely reliable guide. Therefore, the Dharma and the Sangha is reliable. But moreover, we see the final refuge of our own ultimate resultant state of Buddhahood as the goal. This goes on. The ones that you have remaining we'll deal with that next week. That gets us to verse 27. 27 is going to begin our exploration of the actual topic, this fourth topic, Vajra point, which is, as it says here on page 86, I believe. Let me get it up on my lap here. Page 86, we're going to get into an explanation of the basic element of the Tathagata essence, which is the remainder of everything that we're going to work with in this course. We're not going to get beyond that into the final three Vajra points in any detail. But we see that what we have here, an individual presentation of the four causes and conditions. This is introducing the last four Vajra points, saying first there's the causal phase, an explanation of the basic element of the Tathagata essence. And then the second topic that is delineated there, again, we won't be looking at commentary on that for the verses. Note that there are books out there that do go into them, not from the Lukpa point of view, but if you do have a desire to study the text beyond that. What we are going to be studying is here the causal phase, an explanation of the basic element, the Buddha nature, of this Tathagata essence. So let me just introduce this and then we're going to do our discussion. From here on, the remainder of the text extensively explains in sequence these four bases. So we're going to see that as we get into verse 27, that we start talking about kind of the initial proof as to why Buddha nature exists. The initial three reasons that we can establish that all beings have the ability to become enlightened. This is a very inspiring verse. You'll see it. Verse 27 is recounted in a number of texts, including the book that's on your book reading list, this wonderful book, Samsara, Nirvana, and Buddha Nature, part of this series as His Holiness Venerable Chodron are doing, the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. I might mention that with His Holiness's birthday, there's a sale at Wisdom Publications for 50% off all of the books. If you don't have any of them, you might think of getting them now because 50% off is significant savings if you are interested in purchasing any of that series. I think there are 7 volumes already or something, the 8th volume on the way. Yeah, are there that many already? Yeah. They're amazing. I spent some of the earlier part of this year when I wasn't teaching going through them. I got up into the 5th one, I think, or something, but I still have a bit more to go. So anyway, just know that if you are interested in those resources, that's out there. Okay. We do have one comment in the chat. I've been curious about the bodhisattva nature of a Buddha existing simultaneously with being absorbed in emptiness. The Bodhisattva. Not sure I'm getting the full question, but the idea of um, how a Buddha can exist with the mind completely absorbed in emptiness and yet engaged in activities. Again, I think that's one of these unfathomables. I think that's what we're getting at to some degree too, is how can you have this mind that is completely absorbed in ultimate truth, yet fully aware of conventionalities and playing to that continually through activities of, trying to enlighten all the beings that are unenlightened. So what we're going to do now for about another 20 minutes or so, I have, by the time we start, it'll be about 35 minutes after the hour. So we'll do this until about 5 minutes too, and then we'll come together and see what questions people have. I'd like to encourage you, as we usually do, to take a look at some of the questions that you can certainly work with last week's topic, since you probably have had some time to go into those in some detail. That would be the topics that are on this sheet that is for session 5, but covered in session 4. The definition and description of the qualities of the Dharma jewel, which we went through last week, as well as the Sangha jewel. Though if you're tempted to go beyond that, if you really feel like you've got those down and understand them, then we do have a few questions that pertain to tonight, including the presentation of the meaning of refuge in terms of those 6 types of person, final and provisional refuges as well, and then the meaning of jewel. And then, of course, these 4 aspects related to the inconceivable aspects of the Tathagata essence that are solely the objects of knowledge of Buddhas. I didn't get to, again, question 6 there. I was being very optimistic that I would get into that. So again, I can't keep these on the screen while you're doing your discussion, but nonetheless, if you have those in front of you, otherwise, again, just work with your understanding of these topics. And if someone could lead the discussion for the group that's online, that would be great. And then we have a group here in the Gompa that can discuss. So we'll come back in 20 minutes. Enjoy your discussion. So let's see if there were any questions from the discussions. I don't know what people ended up discussing online. I was listening to what was going on here, but anything?
Fernando, do you want to?
Do I want to share what we were discussing? We were speaking about the jewels, and there are jewels because of the rarity of them and the difficulty of us as beings or sentient beings approaching them, and how it depends on merit and stuff. And although the interdependence between the 3 type of jewels, for the Buddha to appear, and then for an Arya Bodhisattva, which is the Sangha jewel, to become as such, it might depend on, or it depends on a Buddha to have appeared and to have taught Dharma, and to practice, in order for this Arya Bodhisattva to practice, in order to at some point become the Buddha, which would be again the jewel of Dharma. I don't know how to put it in another word. And we were also discussing between the different perspectives of the bodhisattvas that are before the 8th Bhumi and the ones passing the 8th Bhumi, and the difference in their perspective, because we were discussing how it's difficult to perceive in a simultaneous way because of the David Lee question in relation to perceive on a simultaneous base the experience of emptiness and arousal of bodhicitta. But that's only in the case of a Buddha, for what I have heard from you and many other teachers. Right. It's only a Buddha, the ones that can experience it on a simultaneous way, right? Nonetheless, what's his name? Sean was telling us that when you get to the 8th Bhumi, you can enter and you can be in and out of the meditative equipoise and be able to be clearing out all those obstructions to knowledge on a faster way. Although I don't know how it is, since I guess that it will take me a time to get to the 8th Bhumi from now on. I hope soon though.
Yeah, it'll take us all a while, I think. Thanks, Fernando. Yes, good to see you again. So were there any questions on that, of what you all discussed? Any questions? Or here in the conference?
I was interested.
Well, go ahead.
Sean?
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, so,
Oh,
yeah, I raised the question,
oh, Dave.
if,
Okay.
if a Buddha is absorbed in emptiness, it seems like that's an all-encompassing state. And so at the same time, the Buddha is helping sentient beings. So my question was, is he leaving the state of emptiness and bliss to help human beings at the same time? Or are they both happening simultaneously? Or,
Yeah,
I'm just really at a loss as to what
I understand.
the
Yeah,
story
this
is.
is, I guess, again, part of that unfathomable or hard to discern, difficult to comprehend. That a Buddha is actually said to be in both states simultaneously. Complete knowledge of ultimate truth at all times, the emptiness of all phenomena. So that wisdom that is essentially a meditative equipoise is happening concurrently with the knowledge of all conventional reality. And then, of course, the enlightened activities that stem from that, because, of course, if a Buddha knows the minds of particular beings, then a Buddha is instantly manifesting in a way to help those sentient beings based on their predispositions and their particular situations. But this gets to be very unfathomable. And that's why, again, prior to enlightenment, it can be one or the other. Either the bodhisattvas in meditative equipoise on emptiness in that state, or they are out of that in what's called subsequent attainment with a mind that is having conventionalities appear to it and an ability to interact with beings in that realm in that way, but can never have both. And again, it becomes closer and closer until you get to the 10th ground and the final moments of a sentient being when the final obscurations are removed and then both truths are known simultaneously. But it's said to be completely simultaneous and again, very difficult to fathom because again, a Buddha doesn't have a conceptual mind at all. So there's no concepts going on in the way that we have concepts of doing this, doing that, thinking this, thinking that. Instead, a Buddha instantaneously is having all of these ways of manifesting for beings and what have you. So I agree, David, it's very hard to get our heads around what that is, what that must be like.
Well, I had another question. It stumped me, and the group tried to answer what it is that we mean by adventitious.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So adventitious just simply means that things are present because we haven't created the causes for them to be removed. So adventitious is simply something that will kind of take over at that time as long as there's no antidote to it. They're kind of, again, like we could say the clouds are adventitious in the sky. They're not in the nature of the sky, but they will come into the sky and appear and accumulate and then eventually disappear and what have you. All of these things that are examples of kind of the ways that things can be temporarily defiled. That's what we mean by adventitious, that it's only there on that temporary set of causes and conditions that give rise to it. And being adventitious, therefore, it can be removed by creating the causes and conditions that are opposing it, that cause it to no longer be able to exist. So, does that help?
Yeah, it helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. If there aren't any other questions, let's, did we see? Did Sean have one as well? Yeah, maybe. Let's go to Sean. Yeah.
Well, mine was just when we talk about purifying the defilements, it was more of, is the method of purification mainly just observing the natural state, because the natural state is free of impurities, so there's not really anything to purify in that sense. Because I was thinking in like the Dzogchen lineage, like you're looking at the resultant vehicle where, I mean, what is there to purify? Like, unless, and so that you're using that pointing out instruction to point out the natural state. So it's like maintaining that natural state. If you maintain that natural state, then that's already, that purifies things, seems like.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know so much about Dzogchen, but I think they're all working still. His Holiness, I went to some teachings His Holiness gave in France in 2002, I think it was. I can't remember, 2001, 2002, when he was teaching on Dzogchen. And he said essentially in Dzogchen, you're realizing emptiness. You're using a different methodology, if you will, to get to it, but it's the same idea. And I think what you're speaking to, Sean, in terms of when we see that things have no inherent nature, that this is what their nature is to be free of that, to be empty of that. You can come at it from those two vantage points, if you will. I mean, to kind of see the natural purity of it, or to create the antidote that is the opposite of that. Again, in the Gelukpa approach and what we're looking at in these teachings, it's very much coming from the point of view of we need to introduce this antidote. And it's just how you're going to get to that antidote. His Holiness says you'll arrive at the same place, which is the realization of suchness, emptiness, thusness, whatever we want to call it. But it's just a different technique to get there. He says if you don't get there, then you can't be removing these afflictions, because there's not an antidote in the mind to do that. But whether we get at it from removing what we are fabricating or seeing the natural purity as that is there, it's kind of arriving at the same destination. I don't know if that makes sense. But again, there are different techniques and different ways of doing that, but they all arrive at the same point. I think when we look at the Zen tradition, which I don't know that much about either, where they're using koans and particular ways of kind of confounding this hard-lined conceptual mind to get to a place of sort of surrendering, if you will, to the voidness, then it's a different approach again. But you have to get to that place. You have to get to that place where you have a non-conceptual awareness of reality. And that will be the force by which all of this will happen. So, all right. Probably good enough to stop there. If there are other questions, again, please pass them along to me, to Venerable Dundrup, to someone. We'll make sure that they get answered in a future session. But certainly at the beginning of next week, I will start with any questions. So again, what we're going to do next week is begin on page 86. If you'd like to read through, I don't know if you've been reading through any of this in advance, because again, I've been skipping a lot of the commentary. You might read through the first few pages, 86 through maybe like 88. I am going to skip a bit of the bottom of 88 and to all the way middle of 91, because again, there's just so many of these passages that go into a lot of sutra citings and citations and what have you. And so it just gets to be a little too much to cover. But otherwise, please just feel free to kind of cover the material that we've already talked about in your study over the next week. And then when we do the discussion, you can certainly review that. Let's put on the screen the prayers. Again, make sure that your microphones are muted if you're online before we do these prayers, just to make sure that it's not all over. Let's recite these two verses to begin with. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. So as we recite this prayer for His Holiness, just make very, very deep thoughts of wishing for this amazing being. Again, if this is an enlightened being, as most of us hold, then we needed to create causes from our side to experience the enlightened activities in this world from this being. So thinking with that strong motivation, that's not just for ourselves, but for the sake of all beings in this world, we make strong prayers for His Holiness's wishes to be fulfilled, for him to have a very, very long life and perfect health. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then for Rinpoche to swiftly return. Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings, Through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And let's make strong prayers for those that we're holding in our hearts right now, whoever we know who are experiencing difficulties, obstacles, sickness, who are dying or who have died recently. Send this positive energy out to them so that it benefits them immediately, removes their suffering, and gives them all of the causes and conditions that will lead them to perfect enlightenment. May this be so for all beings who what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much for joining tonight. Again, we'll reconvene next Thursday. Take care and be well. See you.